Sometimes we hear or read things quoted by government officials and we take them at face value because these quotations, in their intended moral context, sound very good and idealistic. I remember often hearing Barack Obama, when he was President of the United States, quoting from whom he called our founding fathers things like, one nation under God, and all men were created equal. Now, how can a country justify itself as being one nation under God or stating that all men were created equal when that nation perpetuated slavery for almost 400 years, had segregated schools, bathrooms, and restaurants? Was there a racial God identity existing then and now? I would like to suggest that at the heart of many historical and ongoing debates about identity, morality, and justice, phrases like one nation under God and that all men were created equal reflect aspirational ideals rather than an exact reflection of the lived reality. In the history of certain nations, these words, in their most favorable interpretation of them, is that they are invoked as a guiding vision and a promise of what a country should strive to become rather than what it is. For instance, when a nation perpetuates slavery, segregation, or systemic inequality, these actions starkly contradict its founding ideals. And this dissonance has fueled many movements for justice and equality throughout history. In the United States, leaders like Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. and others pointed out these contradictions, challenging the society of their times to live up to its stated values. Frederick Douglass famously questioned how a nation could celebrate liberty while oppressing millions. This was in his 1852 speech called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" The irony of these contradictions has shaped conversations around justice, progress, and reconciliation. For many, the pursuit of living up to such ideals continues to be a work in progress, even when they fail to acknowledge past wrongs and perpetuated atrocities and are striving to forge a more equitable future. I am neither a politician, a philosopher, or a learned scholar, but I do believe that a nation must openly confront its past and present failures before it can live up to its ideals. This involves education about historical injustices, have transparent discussions, recognize and acknowledge existing systemic injustices and inequalities. Truth is a necessary foundation for progress. Actions must follow acknowledgement. And I suggest reparations, whether in the form of financial compensation, policy changes, or community investments. These can address the lingering effects of historical injustices. I did not always believe in reparations, but after listening to a lecture by Dr. Hilary Beckles of the University of the West Indies, I was led to believe that reparative measures show accountability and a commitment to redress. If a country truly wants to practice its espoused philosophy of change and progress, laws and policies that perpetuate inequality need to be dismantled and replaced with systems that truly uphold the principles of equality and justice. Addressing gender discrimination is crucial, as in the case of Dominica, where a woman as a director in a company, the bank will demand that a lawyer must verify her competence to sign for a loan on behalf of her company, whereas that requirement does not apply to a male director. Citizens need opportunities to learn and reflect on the ideals and the ways their society falls short. Education systems should foster critical thinking about history and inspire civic engagement to help shape the future. To align reality with ideals, those most affected by injustices must have a central role in conversations about desired progress. The amplification of their voices must demand the accountability of the lawmakers. The decadence of imperialistic, colonial, and just laws must be dismantled and replaced by laws which serve the nation in the mode of fairness and true justice. Ultimately, creating harmony between ideals and reality is a continuous process of reflection, accountability, and action. And let me here speak for a little while about what was called emancipation in countries like the United States and Jamaica. What was called emancipation, while I acknowledge it was a monumental step toward freedom, it often transitioned into new forms of oppression and systemic barriers that hindered the progress of the so-called freed people. The promises of liberty were frequently undermined by colonial powers and entrenched systems of inequality. After what was called emancipation, many formerly enslaved individuals faced economic exploitation and political disenfranchisement. In the United States, for example, what was called Reconstruction initially offered people hope with measures like the 14th and 15th Amendments, which aimed to secure citizenship and voting rights for African Americans. However, these gains were systemically eroded by the Jim Crow laws, racial violence, and judicial decisions that upheld segregation and inequality. Freed people were often forced into exploitive labor arrangements such as sharecropping, which kept them in cycles of poverty and dependence. In the colonial context, emancipation did not necessarily mean the end of exploitation. Systemic barriers also extended to education, housing, and employment. Segregation and discriminatory practices excluded freed people from opportunities to build wealth and access quality education. In the United States, redlining and other housing policies entrenched racial disparities, making it difficult for the African American people to achieve economic stability. These systemic barriers were not just remnants of the past, they evolved into modern forms of inequality and continue to affect marginalized communities. Addressing these issues requires acknowledging historical injustices and implementing policies that promote equality and inclusion. In Jamaica, for instance, the abolition of slavery was followed by economic policies that favored plantation owners and marginalized freed people. Land ownership was restricted, and many emancipated individuals were pushed into low-paying jobs, perpetuating economic disparities. The oppressive rural plantocracy in Jamaica persisted as a significant barrier to the progress of the so-called freed people. Even after emancipation, while slavery ended in 1834, the plantation system and its power structure remained deeply entrenched. Plantation owners who had long dominated the economy and wielded political influence continued to exploit the labor of freed people through systems like how the employment was shared out on the plantations, paying as little as possible because they know that there were not too many other jobs. Freed people often faced significant challenges in acquiring land, as plantation owners restricted land sales to maintain control over the labor force. This forced many emancipated individuals to remain economically dependent on the plantations, perpetuating cycles of poverty and inequality. I grew up in part of that era. The establishment of freed villages such as Sligoville and Sturgedown provided some opportunities for independence, but these efforts were met with resistance from the plantocracy, which sought to undermine such initiatives. Additionally, the plantocracy's influence extended to political and social systems, ensuring that the interests of the elite were prioritized over those of the broader population. This created systemic barriers to education, economic mobility, and political representation for freed people, further entrenching inequality into their lives. The legacy of the rural plantocracy highlights the complexities of emancipation and the ongoing struggle for justice and equity in post-emancipation societies. I'm presently in the process of writing a book about my experiences with rural plantocracy. Those who dared to speak out posed a direct challenge to the entrenched power structures. Advocates for change were branded as radical communists who must be silenced. Or using similar rhetoric was a strategy to discredit dissenters and stoke public fear into the minds of the people. This approach served to delegitimize calls for reform and protect the interests of the elites, effectively marginalizing voices that spoke for the economic disenfranchised. The economic lives of uneducated people, particularly in post-emancipation Jamaica, were often restricted by the lingering power of plantation owners. Limited access to land, resources, and education created a cycle of dependence and entrenched poverty. Efforts to expose or disrupt this system, whether through advocacy, organizing, or education, were frequently met with fierce resistance as they threatened the foundations of rural oligarchy. The journey from the oppressive conditions of the rural plantocracy in past emancipation Jamaica to where society stands today is one of resilience, struggle, and transformation. Emancipation was a historic milestone, but it marked the beginning of a new set of challenges rather than an outright liberation. Freed people encountered systemic barriers, including restricted access to land, were forced into exploitive labor systems and entrenched social hierarchies that continued to marginalize them economically and politically. So after emancipation, plantation owners who still held significant wealth and political power worked to preserve the plantation economy by restricting opportunities for freed people. Land ownership was one of the most pressing issues. The refusal to sell land to former slaves and so-called freed individuals forced many into low-paying agricultural labor, perpetuating their dependence on the plantocracy. Free villages where freed people purchased land collectively provided some hope for independence, but these initiatives were limited and often opposed by the ruling elite. The struggles for the early years following emancipation laid the foundation for significant resistance. Peasant farmers, laborers, and community leaders began to organize and advocate for justice, leading to movements of rebellion and protest, such as the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865. That rebellion, led by Paul Bogle and others, was a direct response to the harsh living conditions and oppressive systems imposed by the plantocracy. While brutally suppressed, it sparked reforms and brought attention to the plight of the marginalized. Over time, the rise of labor movements in the 20th century, particularly in the 1930s, marked a turning point. Leaders like Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley fought for workers' rights and championed social reforms that challenged the entrenched inequalities of the rural oligarchy. These efforts led to gradual dismantling of the plantocracy's hold and fostered the emergence of a more inclusive society. The transition to independence in 1962 was another milestone that allowed Jamaicans to take greater control of their political and economic systems. While independence did not erase the legacy of colonial exploitation, it provided a platform for addressing systemic barriers through policy changes, education reforms, and economic diversification. Today, Jamaica continues to navigate the challenge of inequality and systemic injustice, but significant progress has been made. The nation has produced remarkable achievements in culture, education, and economic development, fueled by the resilience and creativity of its people. The spirit of resistance that defined the struggles against the plantocracy remains a driving force in shaping Jamaica's identity and aspirations. This complex journey from oppression to resilience and resistance and transformation is a testament to the strength and determination of the Jamaican people. Jamaica has now entered a new phase of geopolitical complexity. The dynamics of Chinese investments in Jamaica, coupled with America's concern about losing influence in the region, present a multifaceted challenge. China's Belt and Road Initiative has brought significant infrastructural development to Jamaica, including highways and ports, but also it has introduced destructive bauxite mining operations. While these investments have contributed to the economic growth of the country, they have also raised concerns about debt dependency and environmental impacts, particularly in sensitive areas like the Cockpit Country. The Cockpit Country, a biodiverse rainforest and vital source of fresh water, has been at the center of controversy due to bauxite mining. Despite unrealistic government assurances that bauxite mining would not occur within the protected boundaries, environmentalists and local communities, including the Maroons, argue that mining activities encroach on ancestral lands and threaten ecosystems. The economic benefits of bauxite exports are weighed against the risks of deforestation, water contamination, and the loss of biodiversity. On the geopolitical front, America's concern about China's growing presence in the Caribbean reflect broader strategic interest. The U.S. views the region as its third border and has historically sought to maintain influence through initiatives like the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. China's investments, however, challenge this dominance as they provide alternatives for regional development and deepen economic ties with the Caribbean nations. This intersection of environmental, economic, and geopolitical issues underscores the complexity of navigating foreign investments and regional sovereignty. For Jamaica to bridge the gap between its ideals and its realities, the people must play an active role. Educating communities, fostering civic engagement, and holding leaders accountable are critical steps. Demanding the transparency in government decisions and building coalitions to amplify marginalized voices, to ensure that policies prioritizes national well-being over foreign influence. Advocating for sustainable development and preserving resources like the Cockpit country is crucial for long-term progress. Jamaica's story is one of immense resilience, of people who have endured centuries of hardships, yet continue to rise, resist, and reinvent themselves. While the challenges of our past, from slavery through the era of rural plantocracy and the complexities of modern issues such as foreign investments and environmental protection, it may seem daunting, but they are not insurmountable. We stand on the shoulders of those who fought for justice, and their legacy reminds us that progress is not only possible, but inevitable when driven by the collective will of the people. The path forward lies in unity, education, and unwavering advocacy for justice and equity. It lies in amplifying the voices of the marginalized, holding our leaders accountable, and preserving the treasures of our island, like the Cockpit country, for generations to come. Each step we take forward, transparency and sustainability and inclusion brings us closer to a Jamaica that truly reflects the ideals of freedom, equality, and dignity for all. Let us, my brothers and sisters, hold fast to the hope that our strength lies in our unity, creativity, and determination. The solutions are within our grasp, and the foundation for a brighter and more equitable future is already being laid. As we continue to face these challenges with courage and resolve, we can look to the horizon with anticipation for a Jamaica that not only honors its history, but boldly shapes its destiny. Together, we can achieve it. Together, we will. So, my Istren, I'm a brethren, I'm there with you.